You're listening to an ECGI podcast on corporate power and the politics of change with Matteo Gatti.
My book, Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, is about corporations that have stepped into political spaces, taking actions and positions on guns, voting rights, climate, LGBTQ issues. This phenomenon raises fundamental questions about democratic legitimacy and accountability. I call it corporate governing. One of the crucial questions is how shareholders should respond when their companies engage in politics. Shareholders care about the profitability of corporations, but they also have values. And for decades, a specific mechanism built into the federal securities framework has served as primary channel for shareholders' value communication, the shareholder proposal. Investors place a resolution on the corporate ballot, signal their priorities, and create a public record. It does not technically force management to do anything, but in practice, these resolutions are important. Executives who disregard them do that at their own risk. Today's episode traces the arc of that system from three directions. First, we ask, why has corporate political engagement become so fraught, and what does it mean for shareholders and their ability to communicate with management? We will then look at some empirical evidence about shareholder proposals. What do we actually know about how the proposal process has functioned as a tool for political accountability? And we'll close with the hardest question. What happens next? Because the entire ecosystem is now under coordinated assault. Matteo Gatti, this is Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, an ECGI podcast. Stay with us. Welcome to Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, an ECGI podcast. I'm Matteo Gatti, professor of law at Rutgers Law School, research member of the European Corporate Governance Institute, and the author of Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, published by Cambridge University Press. My book documents the phenomenon of corporate governing, as I call it, the way firms have stepped into contested political and social spaces in ways that look a lot like government action. The question I want to take up today is what shareholders can actually do about it. What mechanisms exist for investors to weigh in on how their companies engage politically, whether those mechanisms have worked, and what it means that they are now under serious attack. I have two great guests today, Jill Fisch and Tim Smith. Jill is the Sol A. Fox Distinguished Professor of Business Law at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. She's one of the most influential and prolific corporate law scholars of her generation. Two co-authored papers form the backbone of our first two segments. A 2024 article diagnosing what she and her co-author Jeff Schwartz called political posturing, the peculiar dynamic by which corporations have been drawn into political controversy. And a 2026 paper also written with Jeff Schwartz that proposes a framework for reconciling the apparent tension between corporate values and long-term economic value. She's also the co-author with Adriana Robertson of a 2025 empirical paper on the political disclosure proposal ecosystem, which anchors our third segment. Tim Smith is the senior policy advisor at the Interfaith Center of Corporate Responsibility, where he supports work around responsible political engagement with asset management, and responding to the pushback on ESG. Before that, he was the director of ESG shareholder engagement at Boston Trust Walden. Tim has been pressing corporations on political and social behavior for decades. He's also, as we will see, now helping to litigate the legal future of the proposal system. Jill, Tim, welcome. It's great to have you both on the podcast.
Thank you,
Glad to be here.
Okay, let's start with the political engagement, or as you, Jill, put it, political posturing. Your 2024 paper with Jeff Schwartz opened with a claim that current corporate political engagement is qualitatively different from prior eras. You use the phrase political posturing as the organizing concept. What exactly do you mean by it, and how is it different from, let's say, the corporate social responsibility era of the 70s and the stakeholder debates of the 80s and 90s?
Thanks, Matteo. So the paper with Jeff is actually a very small intervention in this space. We're focusing on what we call political posturing, and political posturing is really a subset of political engagement. So in that paper, what we were particularly critical of was empty statements, corporations essentially taking political positions, but what you might call cheap talk not necessarily changing their business practices. Like Black Lives Matter was a great example, corporations speaking out, but there were a number of studies that found that a lot of the corporations that signed on to these pledges didn't do anything to address discrimination or hiring practices or anything like that. So the sort of broader of political engagement, I think that's something that Tim's particularly interested in and that we're going to get into further. But our paper basically said corporations are being drawn into this. It's often without a whole lot of thought or without a calculated strategy about how politics relates to the underlying business mission. And that's what often gets them into trouble.
And in the paper, you describe a sort of a feedback loop. How does that work?
So I think what we've seen this increasingly over the last 5 years is corporations facing demand from stakeholders. It can be employees, as in the Disney case. It can be consumers. It can be activist investors. It can even be regulators. So corporations are pressured to take a political position. And that essentially normalizes the expectation that corporations will speak out on hot issues, and it escalates future demands, right? So once a company speaks out on issue A, another group of stakeholders is going to say, well, why not issue B? You have an obligation to take a stand. You are a moral actor. So the corporation's not really making a reasoned decision whether or not to speak. And the process is increasingly invoking corporations in a range of political and social issues without a natural stopping point.
Matteo, I need to intervene here simply to make a distinguish, because I think Jill raised some very important points about popular issues that companies have spoken out about that are in response to political pressure that we see today. But I want to go back over the 55 years that ICCR and its members have been engaging companies on a whole range of corporate social responsibility issues, environmental, social, and governance concerns. And I just want to distinguish between what might be company intervening in a political debate and a company taking responsibility for how its activities affect the community or its employees or the planet. And so I wouldn't describe that as intervening in a political debate. I'd describe that as taking of what they do and how they do it. So an example might be a company's treatment of its employees. And that, of course, unfortunately, many of these issues are highly politicized now, especially on diversity, but on labor issues too. But many companies would say, of course, we're going to try to treat our employees with dignity and treat them responsibly because it's good for long-term business. Or take another example, climate change, a recent issue where companies are saying, we understand the existential crisis we face from climate change, and we're trying to take a stand to address that issue. Now, when they started doing that, they weren't entering into a political debate. Of course, it was political, with quotes, but they were entering into a very important business decision about how they were going to conduct their business. So I just want to distinguish between issues that would seem to be politicized now that are really corporate responsibility issues that companies have stood up and responded to. We just published a list of quotes from companies that describe their commitment to sustainability. And all of those, of course, some of them could be done for PR purposes or political purposes, but they basically describe why this is an important part of their sustainability, is an important part of their business structure because it's good for long-term profitability for the company. So I hope that's a helpful intervention. And
Absolutely. No,
Yeah.
absolutely.
If I can just weigh in too, I would totally agree with everything that Tim said. And that was why, Jeff and I were really very clear in the 2024 piece to distinguish taking a stand from corporations incorporating these components into their operational decision making. Yes, Tim's absolutely right. Corporations every day have to think about, what kind of packaging do we use? How do we treat our workers? Workplace safety? What are our hiring priorities and so forth, right? That's not taking a stand, that's doing business. And the fact that those business decisions have implications for society more broadly can't really be separated from the corporation's economic viability, its reputation, those factors. So we're not saying, yes, corporations should be blind to the impact of what they do. We're saying corporations shouldn't be rushing to take a stand that is in many cases completely independent of what the corporation's doing.
The interesting thing, too, isn't it, Jill, is that many of these issues, which are basically, as you say, doing business, have become politicized. So that if a company speaks out or if an investor speaks out on climate change, the Trump administration is calling it woke and politically motivated. If we take actions on diversity, likewise, we'll be charged with actually violating the Constitution because we're discriminating against white males. So the list goes on and on. Virtually every issue, Matteo, that has been raised over the last 50 years on environmental and social issues has been challenged by the administration as somehow being politically motivated rather than common sense.
Thank you. So it seems to me that there's a line that you both are drawing, which is don't get into a political fight, and I would add probably with a politician, right? And Disney got into a very big one, famously, right? But the reality was that they didn't want to enter into that at the very beginning when the Don't Say Gay legislation was first floated around for the Florida legislature. It's that somebody picked up the story. The Orlando Sentinel published a story showing that Disney was financing the bill proponent. And so a bunch of stakeholders, not investors necessarily, but mostly employees and screenwriters, so, the important stakeholders of Disney started to voice their, discontent on social media. And therefore, Disney decided to intervene rather than staying silent. So this is a very hard case. They didn't really want to weigh in, but they had to, and they decided to go one way. It sort of goes back to the feedback loop in some ways, and there's a component of a stakeholder pressure, but it's a very difficult situation that the executives are faced, right?
It is difficult, and I think, Tim's right. I think these days, even what seem like routine business decisions have a political component. And so, to an extent, I think that gives even more support to our prescription in that article, which is, businesses should err on the side of staying out. Yes, it's a difficult decision to intervene. Maybe that means you limit your battles or you just adopt a general policy. We're not going to weigh in on political and social issues. And then you can't be faulted for favoring one side over the other.
Interesting, excellent points for discussion. In fact, Matteo, what you described was very much a political fight because it was challenging a decision by the governor, and it got into personal attacks both ways. Right? However, I would say that as companies face this very politicized environment, it's important for them to be true to their North Star, to know who they are and what their values are and what makes sense to their communities, their employees, their shareholders, their constituencies, and to be able to be true to that in engaging in public debate, right? So that a company that is under attack for, say, supporting LGBTQ rights, and they're under attack. The government brings it up, or a right wing group attacks them. It's not of their making, and they didn't choose it. But there's no place to retreat if you're being attacked for being politically correct because you support gay and lesbian rights in the workforce. And unless you're going to retreat from that, which some companies have, it becomes a public debate. So I would think that it's not so easy for companies to simply follow the norm. I'm not going to get involved in political fights. They shouldn't be involved in political fights about with candidates, I think. But what are we going to do on a basic business issue like tariffs? If a company lobbies on tariffs and opposes the Trump administration's position, that is going to be seen to be taking a political stand. I think many companies who've spoken out against tariffs have done it without insulting the president or the administration, but simply talked about the impact that this is having and the impact on their customers, right? And do you remember when Walmart, I think it was, first said, this is going to cost our customers X amount of money? I believe it was Walmart. The administration immediately pounded them for daring to say that. It was just stating the facts. So this is very difficult times to follow the principle that Jill is raising. I'll raise one other example that we're all very familiar with. Universities or law firms in the early days of the Trump administration. And we saw some law firms, I would use the term cave in, basically accommodate to the Trump administration, as did a number of universities. And then we saw others take a different position and not simply follow what the administration was demanding or suing them on. So if you get sued for your work on diversity or supposedly a charge that you're anti-Semitic, there's no neutral ground. You can't just say, I'm going to be quiet. You have to say, well, that's a flawed argument. Let me explain why this suit is baseless. We're going to fight it in court. So that's where we get involved in, I'd say, a high percent of the quotes, political arguments these days that aren't simply somebody deciding to get involved in something that's outside their realm. So that would be a bit of a different perspective on this.
That's great. Thank you. So I want to move forward in Jill's production and talk about her 2026 paper because so the diagnosis in the earlier paper, as we just saw, is that, well, a corporate political engagement can go badly. And so the newer paper moves to sort of some prescription, right? And the core argument is that managers should select corporate values that maximize long-term economic value. And this is something that is consistent with what we find in the empirical literature, by the way, because financial economists have found that when corporations act in the socio-political sphere and are politically engaged, when that tracks the expectation of their stakeholders, right? When that tracks with the expectation based on the priors of that specific corporation, something that Tim was mentioning before, the reactions from different spheres of stakeholders, employees on the one hand, the consumers on the other, but also in some cases investors are not necessarily too negative. So what you're doing here is really interesting, Jill. So you propose a reconciliation based on management selects values that maximize long run economic value, right? One could argue management always uses that formula saying, long-term interests of the corporation and shareholders to pretty much justify anything they're doing. I think your paper has a very good answer to these objections.
Well, I think our characterization is very consistent with what Tim said earlier, that a corporation should be true to itself. I think that's exactly right. And so for each corporation, the mix of value and values is going to be different. But I think we make 2 points in our paper. One, you can't really separate the two. Tim said at the very beginning. For a corporation, a lot of values issues are a component of standard operational decision making. Today, they may seem more high profile, they may seem more political, but this is something that corporations have always been doing. So one of the challenges I think in the current debate is you can't draw this bright line, right? So I just read something about, the DOL's posture on ESG, and it's going to be, breach of the duty of loyalty for pension fund managers to take ESG considerations into account. For me, I don't see how ESG is accurately characterized as non-financial. Almost every aspect of the ESG debate has some impact on economic value at least some companies. So, I don't think you can separate the two broadly. And as a result, I don't think that should be either a limitation on fiduciary principles or a reason for silencing shareholders, right? And what's going on at the SEC right now is, well, if it's a shareholder proposal, if it's a shareholder vote on a values related issue, that's somehow illegitimate, right? I don't see that.
I'm going to add to Jill's very good points here. So, from the investor point of view, so I work with a group of investors, about 350 members of ICCR, that together, because we have some big asset managers who are part of us, have over $5 trillion of assets under management. And I formerly worked for an investment firm, Boston Trust Walden, focused on environmental, social, and governance issues. And they did that for their clients because their clients were asking for it. And that we would have we do make a vigorous defense explaining that this is common sense investing. This is taking risk into account as we make investment decisions. And that's a fiduciary duty of a manager to do that, or a pension fund, for example. I sit on the board of Westpath, the United Methodist Pension Board, that has over $25 billion. And they, of course, walk a tightrope being a faith-based investor with their faith values, but also their fiduciary duty to their beneficiaries, to the pensioners, right? So I think that the attacks on ESG investors are wrongheaded in that they don't take into account that in the vast majority of cases, decisions are being made by investors that are wise investment choices too. Now, let me hasten to say there are some investors who will make a choice based on their values. For example, they may say, I could be an individual. I've had family members die of cancer from smoking. I'm never going to own a tobacco company. Or the United Methodist Church would say, we don't own tobacco in our portfolio. They screen them out. But that's not where the major debate occurs as these attacks occur at the state level or the Department of Labor or the House Financial Services Committee. These are attacks saying that ESG investing is always a political choice that's inappropriate to do, and you're violating fiduciary duty. Jill is absolutely right. The present DOL seems to have its head in the sand, not understanding what the investor community is doing. One final point I'll make here, Matteo, to make drive the point home, is that if you look at the investors globally that believe that they are obliged to look at environmental, social, and governance issues because they affect the bottom line, let's look at the Principles for Responsible Investing, a global organization of investors who argue that this is good investing. They have $126 trillion assets under management. These are not fringe investors arguing these cases. These are mainstream investors. Did you talk to Tom DiNapoli, the controller of the state of New York, who's the sole trustee of the state's hundreds of billions of dollars of pension money? He, of course, is going to explain that his role is to protect the pensioner. But he is addressing climate change because he believes it will affect and does affect long term shareholder value. And therefore, he would be irresponsible to ignore the issues of the day that are going to hurt the beneficiaries.
And still, here we are with the administration trying to silence this, right? So, Jill, in the paper, you explain very well that other stakeholders have effective ways to express how they feel about values and how their specific company is handling that. But shareholders are dealing with sort of like a gap. They don't have a very good mechanisms except for what is trying to be dismantled right now. So you wanna elaborate on that?
Yeah. So, and we've already talked about obviously employee pressure in the Disney case. We know that, consumers can engage in boycotts, purchasing decisions. The government as a stakeholder has a huge amount of power. And what we've just been talking about is the government exercising its power on values related issues, saying to companies, we don't want you to be adopting DEI practices, not out of some empirical basis that DEI hurts economic value. The evidence on that is, at best inconclusive, but because this is inconsistent with the administration's values. So, in light of all of those other stakeholders, shareholders are really disadvantaged. And we've seen the threats against the intermediaries, the pension funds, the asset managers. We know that most retail shareholders hold through intermediated investments through mutual funds, through index funds, so they can't do the Wall Street walk. So Tim talked about, if I have values and I don't want to own tobacco, I can sell the stock of tobacco companies. If I'm in the Russell 3000 index fund, or my employer puts me into a well-diversified target date fund, I don't have that option. I referred to the shareholder proposal rule, which, historically has been the one place where shareholders really can weigh in. And you have, I think, in shareholder proposals, a nice illustration of the sort of mix. You have proposals that might have an economic component and a subjective values component. You might have shareholders voting in favor or against that proposal out of different motives for different reasons. And the ultimate vote is going to be an input to the board of directors. This is what one group of shareholders, this is one group of stakeholders, this is what your shareholders think. Our paper says ultimately, we are believers in director primacy. We believe it's up to the board to weigh these inputs and decide what's best for the corporation. But with respect to social and political issues, managers to a certain degree are insulated. They may have blinders. They may benefit from information from a broader segment of the population. And shareholder input is also an important check against management self-dealing. We don't want the corporate values to become the manager's values.
And in the paper, at some point, you mentioned that there are other channels that are used. Like one is shareholder engagement outside of the annual meeting. And I think we contributed to a book together a few years ago. I would say that that route is very helpful, but the main route of the annual meetings resolution gives everybody a check on, sort of gives the pulse of where the shareholder base is, because you never know how to engage and whether you're engaging with the wrong investor. But if you have some metric to deal, and those metrics all of a sudden are gone because we cannot vote any longer on those, then the engagement exercise becomes tougher, and and query whether that's going to be the second attack that the administration is going to bring, because you never know, right?
But Matteo, I think you make two good points here. One, that there are literally hundreds, probably thousands of engagements with companies every year. I'm just thinking about our members or state and city pension funds, for example. But if you talk to BlackRock or State Street, they will describe the thousands of engagements they have on everything from executive pay to governance to climate change. And so these are quiet, behind the scenes discussions, but they have great influence. But as you also said, these are private, and therefore there's no way to poll shareholders as a whole through that. But I think it's a very important tool that has been there since the 55 years that I've been involved in doing shareholder resolutions, and it deserves due respect and deserves to continue. On the other side, as you've just described, the shareholder resolution is a wonderful polling tool, isn't it? You put up a resolution. Say there's a resolution by a conservative group that says, "I want to go get rid of everything related to diversity. It's wrong-headed. We shouldn't do it." And that gets 1.5% of the vote. That tells you something, right? So last year, there was a resolution to John Deere asking for that kind of dramatic anti DEI position, the 1.5%. There was another resolution asking for forward action on diversity that got 28%. Well, it tells the board something. It's input to the management and board and to other shareholders. It also lets shareholders say, we're the owners of the company and we would like to express our opinion on given issues. And that's, I know we're going to talk about this in a second. That's why it's so sad to see the fact that the SEC has stepped back from the proxy process this year and companies are free to leave resolutions off at their will.
I just want to go back to something you said about BlackRock. I started to think about, large index funds, and, now they're under pressure to change their voting policies. And in fact, Jill, in the paper, you also take a position about the voting choice programs that are being rolled out by large institution, and you think that those don't really do the job quite right.
Yeah, so these programs, which have been labeled voting choice or proxy choice, are designed to give retail investors in mutual funds some input into how the funds vote. Problem with these programs is twofold. One, they're not really choice. The retail investors are choosing from a curated menu of voting policies. And these voting policies, ironically, are developed by proxy advisory firms. And these are the same firms that President Trump, in his executive order, said are too dangerous to provide recommendations to institutional investors. But it's okay for them to decide how retail investors' votes are going to be cast. So, a little irony there. They're limited menu, and they're not particularly transparent. So Dorothy Lund and her co-authors have a really interesting paper in which they look at how the votes are actually cast, and they find things that no retail investor would have predicted from the name or the description of the voting policy. So, it isn't really facilitating choice at all. Second problem, institutional investors have spent years developing the expertise that informs their voting decisions, including the hiring of experienced stewardship teams. And with that expertise comes the heft that allows institutional engagement, what you and Tim were just talking about, to be effective. When an institutional investor meets privately with an issuer, they've done their homework, they come to the table with informed vision, informed recommendations, and so forth. And they can credibly say, look, if you don't agree with us, we'll take this issue to the rest of the shareholders. Don't cater to us because we're a special interest. Let the shareholder body as a whole decide. So voting choice programs fragment institutional voting and make that engagement less effective. And it's been, don't get me wrong, institutional engagement and institutional voting have been tremendously effective over the last 20 years at increasing corporate accountability to shareholders.
I couldn't agree more with Jill's last point about the importance of that, the voting power of institutional investors. I think the train's leaving the station on the pass-through voting, but I also agree with Jill that if you look at Vanguard's, I think it's 4 choices, Jill, they're very narrow, one social choice, but I think State Street has about 10, but this is for retail investors. The major point I'd make, because it's related very much to the attacks on the proxy advisors, ISS and Glass Lewis. If you listen to a meeting of the House Financial Services Committee, you'll see a script being read by dozens of Republicans saying these foreign-owned companies are dictating votes in our country and they're massively controlling the votes. Well, the reality is, I was just in DC talking to some legislators' offices, and we had with us a major investment firm. And one of the woman representing that firm said to explain to the staffer, we are indexed. We vote 15,000 proxies a year. They own that many companies, right? Because they're global too. So we have to hire consultants to help us do research and gather information about how to vote, which we believe is a responsibility and a right, but an obligation as well. Of course, we tell our proxy advisor what our proxy guidelines are. In other words, Glass Lewis or ISS doesn't vote for us using their guidelines, they use our guidelines. And if there's one place the guidelines unclear, they'll come and talk to us about it. Well, so the myth that somehow Glass Lewis and ISS are controlling these massive number of votes is just that, it's a myth. Major institutional investors develop their own proxy voting guidelines. And finally, for if anybody's interested, there is new competition coming in to the proxy advisory firm arena as well, with groups like Iconic who are coming in cheaper and perhaps leaning more in a social progressive manner. But the last point I would make, unfortunately, Jill, as we talk about the power of the BlackRocks and State Street and Dimensionals and Vanguard, is that the voting record of these firms, ICCR has just done a study of this that we published a couple of months ago. The voting records of these firms is sometimes just dismal. Vanguard for the last 2 years has voted for 0 environmental and social issues. That is, from my point of view, a violation of fiduciary duty. They aren't even paying attention to issues that have a great deal of impact on companies financially. And that's not just me saying that, that's companies saying, we know these issues impact us financially. That's why we're paying attention to it. Vanguards suddenly decided to sit on the sidelines. BlackRock and Dimensional, same thing. Goldman Sachs, shockingly, last year, likewise, absent, AWOL. And BlackRock's not much better, about 10% or so. But then you have other investment firms, whether it's Northern Trust or investment firms and pension funds in Europe or TIA Crefts, voting substantially much more favorably for social and environmental resolutions. Vanguard is saying that they're protecting shareholder interests. We're only voting for things that have a financial impact on our clients, and we're protecting that. Well, why does Northern Trust or Legal in General or uh, TIA Crest vote differently, even though they have the same guidelines? They're using the same lens and they understand climate change or diversity or human rights to have that significant material impact on companies. So they're voting for that same resolution. So it makes one wonder, doesn't it, if companies like Vanguard, and which has been sued by the state of Texas and settled, and BlackRock are just basically listening to the attacks that they're facing from the right and voting accordingly. It makes one worry.
Get to the how you should respond to these attacks because you've been taking quite a different approach. Before we do that, I want to spend a few minutes on the study by Jill and Jen Robertson on how shareholder proposals have actually performed. So you ran an empirical study about political disclosure proposals. Those proposals are asking companies to disclose their political spending, lobbying activities, and trade association membership. And you found out, among many other things, that those are the highest volume in the ESG category. So do you want to give us an idea of how the core findings of the paper?
Sure. So the reason we looked at political disclosure proposals, these are proposals asking corporations to disclose their political activity, their expenditures, their lobbying activity, or both. The reason we looked at this is because, one, these proposals are persistent. They've been a substantial percentage of shareholder proposals for years, and they command substantial support, right? So support levels averages of 25 to 30%, but that masks, for reasons I'll go into, that masks in some cases even majority support, much higher levels. Two, it's not clear to me that these proposals easily fall in the ESG category. And one of the challenges studying shareholder proposals today is the whole political dynamic, right? So these have been going on for a long time. We can come up with, as Tim said, a lot of economic reasons why a corporation's political activity might expose it to risk. It might be something that shareholders want to manage from a financial perspective. But there's also the Citizens United case and the idea that shareholders should have some role in overseeing their corporation's political activity, that might even be required based on First Amendment grounds. So it's also a nice example of proposals that have these kind of mixed motivations, right? So transparency in a corporation's political engagement, I think, is something that the evidence shows shareholders care about. Our study also showed the proposals themselves, the proposals that go to a vote, are really the tip of the iceberg. So one challenge again with this area is you see all of these reports. This was the number of proposals that were submitted. This was the level of voting support. But what we found is that a substantial number of proposals are submitted, are the subject of engagement and negotiation, and are subsequently withdrawn with some sort of settlement, with some sort of compromise, but they never make it onto the proxy statement. And in fact, there's no definitive source of all of these proposals. A shareholder proposal doesn't have to be filed with the SEC. It's submitted to the company. And if the company says, you've got some good points here, we're going to make more disclosure, that proposal goes away with no record that it ever existed, unless the company or the shareholder chooses to disclose it voluntarily. So that should really inform the way we study the shareholder voting process. And it kind of reinforces the point that I made earlier, that engagement takes place in the shadow of the shareholder proposal rule. These two things aren't substitutes, they work hand in hand, right? The final thing that we found, and it's challenging to study causation. It's hard to measure improvements in disclosure quality, but based on our research, we found shareholder proposals seem to matter, that companies that are targeted increase their transparency. We found relationships subsequent to the introduction of a shareholder proposal rule, showing that this process, at least in the area of political disclosure, seems to make a difference.
Yeah, I'll definitely add to Jill's excellent points here. Many investors and many companies would describe disclosure of their political spending as good governance. And even disclosure of their lobbying would be described as good governance. So important to stress that about a third of the resolutions that are filed in general get withdrawn because of dialogues and coming to a win-win agreement, as Jill described. But there's scores and scores and scores of examples every year where there's a dialogue with a company and never even talk about a resolution, but the company is making changes or taking suggestions because of that. And when there is a vote, an example last year, not this year, but last year, is 5 resolutions on political spending disclosure got majority votes. Well, that, as Jill says, shows something about investor interest, right? So I think on political spending, we have a strong case because, in fact, the Center for Political Accountability has created a rating system called the Zicklin Index. They did this with the Wharton School. And that index actually rates companies on their disclosure. Companies actually work hard to try to score well on the index. They'll increase their transparency because they believe that it's important to keep up with their peers or to score well on this ranking system. So all of these things come together to say this is an issue that is understood to have an important role in business life, and it should be done transparently.
And so you mentioned before the Citizens United decision and the interesting premise there, if you take the court at face value, is that shareholders could use corporate governance mechanisms to constrain and discipline a corporate political spending. And so how's that worked so far? And isn't the current administration trying to take away one of the main ways to actually deal with political involvement? So that's first part of the questions. And then the second bit is I want to, since you mentioned the Center for Political Accountability, I want to talk about the Montana and Hawaii strategies, right? Where we've seen a different type of strategy. We thought that we had to deal with the constitutional amendment if we disliked Citizens United as a policy, but in reality, there's something else going on. Does any of you want to comment on what's happening in the Citizens United, how it has panned out, and how these new efforts in Montana and Hawaii are trying to sort of steer the debate?
I do want to flag what's going on in Montana and now Hawaii, because these are really interesting initiatives. And what they capitalize on is the fact that corporations are artificial entities. They're created by states. They possess the powers that states give to them. So this is really a fundamental component of states' rights. The fact that a state that creates an artificial entity has the right to designate its powers, right? And this is something that's been true for hundreds of years, right? If a state creates an artificial entity, the state can decide what business the entity goes into, whether the entity can borrow money, whether the entity can enter into certain regulated businesses. Political engagement is no different. So the state presumably has the power to regulate this. We see other examples, right? So if you create a charity, you can say, okay, this charity doesn't have the power to engage in political speech. 501c3 charities can't engage in political speech. Imagine setting up a trust for your child and the trust deciding, okay, we're going to start giving money to political candidates. Obviously, the trust instrument could limit that. So I think it's the same kind of idea that these initiatives are capitalizing on. And there's nothing inherent in the corporate form that requires a state to give corporations this power.
If you think about it, there's no actual constitutional right to have an artificial entity under state law, right? It's the states that decided to grant those, back in the day. But, if you take that step away, then you're losing the corporate political speech rights because the states are inactive. Right. So, okay. So I want to, since we've been talking about it, we're going around it. The system is under attack now, right? So the Trump administration has been engaged in this sort of coordinated and multi-frontal attack. The SEC has first withdrawn from the no action process that gave guidance on proposal exclusions. SEC Chair Atkins has floated the theory that precatory proposals may be impermissible altogether. We mentioned the executive order targeting ISS and Glass Lewis. So, and Texas has enacted legislation that constrains the use of the proposal process by certain investors in that state. Your institution is litigating all of this, right? So we would like to hear what's been happening on that front.
Yeah, just to clarify, we work with a whole wide range of investors who are very concerned about the realities you just described. We're talking about major pension funds and investment firms, foundations, religious investors, and so on. So, yes, indeed, there have been, I think, challenges to the very concept of filing resolutions by Chair Atkins and other commissioners at the SEC. And he has actually said in public that he thinks that these resolutions are a waste of time, certainly a waste of time for the SEC staff as he sees it, but also for companies. And he'd be just as glad to see the SEC out of the business. And that's why this year they pulled out of the process that had been in place. I don't know how many decades, Jill, but decades and decades where they were providing opinions on no action letters by companies. So I should say fortunately and unfortunately, because most companies did not take advantage of the SEC's absence in the shareholder resolution process. They didn't immediately file a petition to have their resolution omitted, and the SEC would give them what's called a no objection letter, meaning I'm not going to give you any opinion. I'm just going to say I have no objection if you do it. So sort of giving them as Carolyn Crenshaw, the former commissioner, said a hall pass, right? Or we would call it a free ride. But most companies didn't do that. They went and talked to their investors as per usual, worked out agreements, or either put resolutions on the proxy. But there were about examples of companies challenging environmental and social issues, and about 60 on governance issues. Now, to be fair, some of these challenges were very well founded. You didn't get it in time or something like that, right? But out of the environmental and social issues, we believe there were a number of companies who just saw an opportunity, stepped in, and therefore omitted the resolution, stepped in and told the SEC they were going to do it, and just went ahead and did it, whether they had firm grounds or not. So investors, I'll give you one example on the political spending issue we've been talking about. One company said they were going to do this, and the investors sued, which they have the right to do. And the company smartly, rather than letting the suit play out and having a preliminary injunction against their stockholders meeting, actually sat down and worked out an agreement to give more disclosure on political spending, and the suit disappeared. Another suit this year by New York State with BJ's Wholesale was about a resolution on deforestation, very mainstream, basic issue. They said they were going to leave it off, and they sued. And the judge issued a preliminary injunction, so they had to put it on. Another BJ Wholesale, again, faced another investor who had filed a resolution on climate last year that got 30% of the vote. And they said, no, we're going to leave it off this year. And the investor, Trillium Asset Management, a leading firm in the ESG space, simply said to them, well, we're going to do an independent solicitation then, but not just for this resolution. We're going to solicit for 3 governance resolutions because you really have poor governance practices. And the company really thought about this. This was them putting a target on their own back, right? And they said, no, they would put the resolution on. So 6 suits this year, Matteo, a number of no vote campaigns going on right now where New York City, New York State, CalPERS, just to mention a few big pension funds, have stated they will be voting no against certain board members who were responsible for these companies leaving these resolutions off. And finally, ICCR has published a document we call a spotlight on corporate governance failures. It's on our website, and we've highlighted about 25 to 30 companies that we think really erroneously are leaving these resolutions off. So that's sort of the hot spotlight of public attention being focused on companies and their reputation. We're arguing they acted irresponsibly and are ignoring their shareholders' views.
Thank you, Tim. I want to ask Jill. I want to understand the legal/policy architecture at stake with the shareholder proposals. Are we talking about real vulnerabilities here from a legal, but also from a policy perspective? Can just the SEC say, you know what, I introduced this rule, and now I decide that we no longer need it? I mean, they've been pretty. They weren't shy with tender offer rules so far, right? They just got a major piece of tender offer regulation without real consultation periods and doing away with all the requirements in the APA. So can they just cancel shareholder proposals they want to?
So I think actually what Tim said is probably the most important point in this podcast. It doesn't really matter what the legal or administration arguments are. Institutional investors have gotten a taste of holding corporate boards accountable. And whatever this administration does, you're not going to put the genie back in the bottle. So yes, the administration can repeal the shareholder proposal rule. But as Tim said, shareholders can resort to independent solicitations that can potentially be much broader, much more costly from a corporation's perspective. Institutions can start a vote no, withhold campaigns against directors. They can support board challenges, election contests. They can vote against executive compensation plans. And to the extent that the administration is backing off on administering things like the shareholder proposal rule, investors can and already have resorted to litigation and done so successfully. So I think if you think about the administration's policy goal, it seems to be cutting back on shareholder voice and shareholder power. And what Tim has just told you is it doesn't seem likely that that's going to happen.
So, and the unfortunate result is, at least from our point of view, the shareholder resolution is a rather civil approach with the company. You're petitioning the company. As Jill said, it's not binding. Maybe we should start filing, or you'll see shareholders filing binding proposals, which I think would be allowed even if the SEC got rid of the shareholder resolution rule, because you'd be doing bylaw amendments. But these are all much more confrontational. And it is not our choice to move in that direction. We want to protect the shareholder resolution rule. We think a lot of private citizens will understand this is a value they don't want to see disappear. But certainly big institutional investors and asset owners are going to be speaking out on this if the SEC actually presents a rule which would eliminate or greatly hinder the shareholder resolution process.
Jill Fisch, Tim Smith, thank you both. This was a fabulous conversation.
Pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, Matteo, we could talk for hours about all of this stuff, but you've given us some really thought-provoking questions, and I hope we'll continue the dialogue.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So the works we've discussed today are linked in the show notes. My book, Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, is published by Cambridge University Press. All episodes in the series are available on the ECGI website and wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube. Thank you so much for listening.